Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a new series of Refinitiv Risk and Compliance webinars. My name is Kais Zakkar, Senior Risk Proposition Specialist for GRC Solutions at Refinitiv. It gives us great pleasure to deliver this webinar to our customers in Middle East and Africa. In today's webinar, we will discuss the supply chain. We will discuss supply chain compliance in the ESG world. I would like to ask the audience to use the toolbar at the bottom of the webinar screen to access resources such as speakers webinar, webinar materials, technical support, and also a survey to capture your thoughts and views on the discussion. There will be an allocated 15 minutes Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Use this window to answer, to pose questions and provide any inquiries you would like to ask the experts. In today's webinar, as I said, we will discuss the supply chain compliance in the ESG world. As you may all aware, against the backdrop of increased regulatory pressure and heightened public awareness, businesses have to consider their approach to the many aspects of ESG, combined with an intense strain placed on supply chain during the pandemic. Businesses have a unique challenge to build or rebuild their partnerships to better achieve their environmental, social, and governance goals. During this webinar, our experts will explore how corporates can mitigate risks and maximize benefits through an ethical approach to due diligence. The agenda for today will start with a discussion around the upcoming legislation obligations, such as the US Forced Labour Litigation, the Australian Modern Slavery Reform, and the German Human Rights Due Diligence legislation. Then we will go through the importance of ESG and how to establish an ESG framework. And after that, the prioritization to determine which ESG factors are relevant to your business. And finally, we will conclude with third-party evaluation techniques and solutions. I am delighted to be joined by esteemed industry experts, such as Mr. Andrew Henderson, the Director of Third-Party Risk Intelligence at Refinitiv, and Ms. Dolores Ortiz, the Head of Legal and Regulatory Compliance at Emirates National Oil Company. I will allow Ms. Dolores to kick off the conversation by giving us an overview about ENOC and tell us more about some key facts of the supply chain in the oil and gas domain. Dear Dolores, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Case, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and depending on where you are. And thanks to Refinitiv for allowing me this opportunity. I am here today as representative for ENOC Group, Emirates National Oil Company, or ENOC. We are actually we're a conglomerate in oil and gas, full spectrum oil and gas company, comprised of about 49 entities. And we have business activities in 60 plus countries. We are owned by the government of Dubai, and I have been working at ENOC's legal department since 2010. Currently, I am heading the legal and regulatory compliance function. So this is just what you're seeing right now on screen is just a little bit to give you an idea of all of ENOC's business activities. When I say we are a full spectrum oil and gas conglomerate, that means that we cover pretty much anything in the oil and gas business, from having exploration and production platforms upstream to midstream processing. We own the refinery in Dubai. We also owned businesses that are dedicated to the storage of petrochemicals in different parts of the world. And we also have a downstream operation. You know, typically the consumers in Dubai know us for the petrol stations, but we also own the sandwich shops in the petrol stations. We also own the retail shops. We also provide jet fuel to the airlines that land in Dubai airport. So it's quite a diversified company. We have about 15,000 employees. And my job is to, be responsible for the legal and regulatory compliance aspect for all those entities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolores.
Thanks, Doraliz. It's Andrew Henderson here. Before we start the main session, it would be great to get a sort of sense of where people are as respondees. So we'd like to start with a poll. If everyone can complete this these set of questions. And it's really setting up an ESG due diligence program or screening program. So if you can let us know whether you have one in place, whether you have one just for governance, or whether you're considering it, or whether you don't believe it's necessary for your business. If we can give you a few minutes to respond to that. Okay, great. So it's good to see the results. About a fifth of you have one in place, which is excellent. But the biggest majority is thinking about what to do about ESG, which is great for our topic today. It's really all about ESG and how to think about putting it into a program which will include some level of screening and due diligence. So what do we mean by ESG? I think that's the first question that people have. And it covers a very wide range of topics. Environmental, obviously, how businesses manage their environment. It can be things like climate change, so carbon. It can be how it manages forests and rivers and various physical attributes, or it's the emissions, resourcing, pumping things into rivers, etc. So there's a wide range of environmental factors. There's a wide range of social factors. Social factors can include how it deals with its own workers, how it deals with people around them, health and safety, how it deals with animals. There's a number of different factors within the social world, but it's really about how businesses treat people. And lastly, it's governance. So how a company is governed, its management, its board, how it deals with tax and payments of tax in various locations, how it pays itself, and really how it manages the functions that are needed to run a company. So those three ESG factors are what we want to talk about today, and how we can think about them in a supply chain world, and how companies can work out what needs to be done. So in this way, people are often asking, well, why do they need to worry about ESG? And we'll cover this in more detail as we go through the session. But really, there's three broad areas as to why you need to deal with ESG. The first one is thinking about it just because you're doing the right thing. You're a good corporate citizen, and you want to do the right thing according to your own beliefs in how things should be run. The second is government telling you what to do. So that could be regulations or legislation. It could be industry bodies, but it can be various people, or various organizations that are telling you what to do. And lastly, it's investors and customers. So if your customers believe that you should operate in a certain way, it's that kind of pressure coming from either customers or investors. And if you're a private company and have investors, it's pressure from those investors, which is obviously a very specific type of pressure. So at this point, it'd be interesting to get the view from Enoch as a a privately owned company, a state company, whether, Doralice, you see these same pressures in your world.
Yes, we do, with the difference that when we're talking, well, first, in terms of doing the right thing, we tend to be at the forefront because we are government owned. And for example, sometimes when, let's say that there's a news published about our company, usually they don't publish the name of the company. They say the government of Dubai is doing X, Y, Z. So it's an extra pressure that we have. And we do strive to do the best, and even if it's not required by the regulators, but certainly there's reputational aspects and even a political relationship aspect that's also our driver.
Excellent. Yeah, it's interesting to sort of hear that even though you're not a private company, you still have an investor. It just happens to be a single investor who is able to very clearly show the direction that they would like you to go into. If we dive a bit into what the doing the right thing aspect is, I tend to talk to clients about it just being good business sense. Doing the right thing along a number of these ESG factors. First of all, it stimulates innovation. There's been a lot of new products and services come out around green products, which are really the same product as someone might have sold 10, 15 years ago, but are much more sustainable. So it's driven companies to think, is their product the best product it could be, or can it exactly the same product and the same profit be derived from something which is more sustainable? And changing the way they think about products. In the same way, it can potentially reduce a lot of waste and costs. You can be doing things better. Thinking about the waste and the impact of waste can drive people to think about better ways of building products and shipping products. Risk management is really a way of thinking about, if you need to bring in a change to some kind of a compliance program, how are you able to do it? Is your organization able to adjust to new processes, changes in the way of doing it? And the more that a company does that, the more they're able to do it. It's like a muscle memory that they build, and they're able to deal with change. Potentially also having products which are more sustainable will be an advantage, either because they're cheaper to produce or they have more of what customers are wanting. And at the moment, there's a lot of customer demand for green products and sustainable products. And lastly, your staff have their own opinions. And I think as we're getting much more sort of younger generations and millennials and further generations, they do have opinions. They do want to work in companies that match their way of thinking about the world. So getting good staff does mean actually following the same kind of views that they have, and retaining and engaging those staff does require companies to think more about how they deal with the world and how that matches with how their staff view the world. And again, Doralice, it'd be interesting to see your view on this.
I agree with all of those aspects, and like I said, also in many ways, we are seen as either being government owned or representing the government. So, I'll give you an example. We have a requirement to hire UAE nationals and to train them. So staff engagement and recruiting and education and interest is a very big component. And Dubai being, always at the forefront of any new developments or technology or environmental efforts, these all components are important to our business and extra incentives for us to have a proper ESG compliance program. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. If we can do another polling question at this point, it'd be interesting to understand whether people agree or disagree with the idea that the social aspect of ESG will become more important in the future. That is, how people and companies deal with their own staff and people around them in the world, but mainly about their own employees. That could be in hiring policies, in diversity policies, human rights, child labour, those kind of aspects. So do people think that that will become much more important in the future? If you could take a few moments to answer that. Okay, well, I think that's fairly unanimous. It's going to become more important. Good to see. Don't think I've ever had a poll question that's 100% one direction. I mean, I agree as well. I think the way companies treat their staff is only going to get more important as staff have more of a voice, I think, as they feel that they have something to say, and they either act by sort of internal activism or they'll leave if they're not happy with how companies are treating themselves and their peers, whether they're in other countries or the way they work. Okay, to some extent, the issues around all of the ESG aspects come into stark relief once adverse issues made their way into the media. And I think Doralice mentioned that in one of her comments, that the media will pick up on everything that companies do, especially if you're a large company and especially if you're well known in a region. And I think we have a number of oil and gas companies in the session today. I think it's very easy for large companies to make it into the media, but once they do, it becomes a challenge. Obviously, that news story stays. It's almost a permanent record. And that's where you have the issue with your investors, you have your issue with your customers potentially, but you also have issues with your staff. Obviously, no one likes to see their own company that they work for with issues in the media that cause them to think whether they want to stay in that company. So I think that's one of the main issues that many companies have, is keeping themselves either out of the media because they're not doing things that cause them to be in there, or they have a message which relates to how they're addressing some of these issues into the future. Okay, the next area that is really driving a lot of ESG discussion now, which wasn't the case probably 2 years ago, is the investor view of ESG. There's a lot of money going into funds which require a certain ESG mandate. There's a lot more information that's being asked of investment funds about how they invest in ESG type companies. So it becomes a chain reaction that if management firms or investment management firms require that information, they ask corporates to give that information, and then they rate them on that. And the ratings now actually drive a significant amount of money that's available for investment. And I think this was probably about 6 months ago, and it's only getting more so. The amount of money going into ESG rated funds has gone through the roof in the last year or so. And LSEG, as a financial data company, is seeing that in a lot of the indices that we're providing. The money is going into ESG-related funds, which means that companies, it's not really a nice to have in some cases, certainly public companies. It's not something that it would be nice, but it is a cost to the business. We're seeing a lot more discussion from internal finance teams and treasury teams saying that having a strong ESG program, which means they have both active management of their supply chain, but also the ability to present that data to their investors, is having a direct impact on the access to funds that they have. And that's really a change that's happened in the last couple of years, and I think it's only going to get more so where responsible investing actually drives a lot of the market decisions. And again, I think ENOC is in a slightly different situation, isn't it? It has a state investor. But Doralice, do you see some of the same pressures on ENOC and the same need from finance to have an ESG message?
Certainly, also because of the industry we're in, right? Oil and gas is heavily regulated in the environmental sector. But I wanted to point out something interesting because, I mean, as a company that operates in the Middle East, in this list that you have, for example, the last one says ESG principles help keep activists at bay. And to be honest, activists are not a factor, at least not in the UAE. And I'll tell you why. It's because activism, as we know in most countries, is illegal in the UAE. I mean, there's no right to First Amendment or freedom of expression. There's no right to picket in the streets or protest. I mean, so if I'm honest with you, we operate more from the perspective of, you know, we have a responsibility being an oil and gas company, and also because we are owned by the government, and also, but not really because we want to satisfy activists as such. So just a clarification. Yeah.
No, that's an interesting point. I think certain regions will operate in different areas.
Yes.
And I think the investors community is obviously also not as big an issue in the fact that there's a single sort of major investor that drives the decision making, but possibly to the same aim, given that it's a reputational issue for the government to buy. Okay, so the next area which is driving a lot of ESG discussion in companies is the legislation and regulation. For corporates, there's a huge number of new regulations either in force or coming. There's modern slavery, so human rights and modern slavery legislation, certainly the UK Modern Slavery Act from a few years ago. Australia has a similar law. California has a similar law. There's the supply chain law in Germany, which came out last year, and a very similar directive from the European Union, which is now sort of moving its way through the European Parliament, but likely this year or next year to actually become a directive, which then European countries need to enact. And that, I think, will have a big impact, not just in Europe, but in the rest of the world that has supply chains into Europe. And that will require European companies to perform much more due diligence and to be looking at more of the social aspects than they maybe had in the past, the environmental and social aspects. So certainly human rights, child labour, slavery, all of those aspects will need to be considered by European companies in the same way as German companies will do at the moment. It's only for the larger companies, but those large companies will drive significant changes because of the supply chains are global for almost all of these large companies. So I think that will be one of the big changes over the next few years as European companies are forced to enact their own due diligence programs for those that aren't currently doing them. They'll be asking for a lot more information from suppliers. And those suppliers that have that information, either readily available or they have a good story to tell, will be preferred suppliers. It will be harder for European companies to work with suppliers that don't have a good ESG track record, because if they can find an alternative, that would be a preferred option. It's just something they're going to have to look at, and once they look, they'll work with companies in their supply chain that make it easier for them to report on their own ESG targets. And on the other side, for investors, there's a lot more disclosure legislation out there. So investment funds now need to say how much ESG content, whether that's the product taxonomies or how they label financial products around ESG. There's a lot more guidance and regulation coming out from the European Union about ESG, and to some extent that's to stop the kind of greenwashing concept where companies say everything's ESG friendly when it's not actually. But what it does mean is that there's a lot more reporting will be mandated by the investment community, which will then be pushed down to the corporate community at the top end, and they will push that further down their supply chains. So there'll be a lot more requirement for information around ESG. And that's what I've sort of made a comment below. ESG for people within a supply chain, it's not just about doing the right thing. It's also about showing that you can do the right thing, because your customers in a supply chain will want to see that information. So it's not just the fact that you don't employ child labour, it's that you can show that. You've got some policies in place, you've got audits potentially, or you do due diligence on your suppliers, and you can package that up in a way to make it easy for the next business in the chain to report on that kind of information. So that reporting is something that I think will be a big change in the next few years. Okay, the next question we often discuss with clients is who are the stakeholders for ESG type topics within a company? And obviously every company is structured differently and has different ways of working. But typically these are the main players in an ESG world. At the very top, you've got the board. And a lot of the times nowadays, boards are providing the mandates to manage in a particular way. And I think that's often, more recently, being driven by investment. And the investors are the ones who are talking to the boards and the chairmen about what they're wanting to see. So the boards are often driving the ESG discussion within companies down to the executive management, who are then obviously putting in place policies and potentially funding of those initiatives. The finance and treasury functions, as I mentioned, are now actually taking much more of a role in ESG because of connection to the investment community. You've also got legal and compliance, who probably have had the traditional role around a lot of these ESG topics for the last 10, 15 years. As new legislation came into place, obviously the legal function would pick up the laws that actually applied to the company, whether that's the child labour laws, modern slavery laws, conflict mineral laws, any of the specific pieces of legislation, obviously the legal teams would pick up, and compliance teams would then actually implement within companies. I don't think that's going to change, but I think because there's more people involved now, the legal compliance role will go from being managing a lot of these risk areas to advising other functions on what they need to do. And I think the function that is being brought into this area around ESG is procurement or supply chain management. Because that's an area that in the past was very much focused on quality of supply and cost. And that's what's seeing, I think, the more fundamental change is it's not just cost and supply. It is all the factors relating to how companies that are supplying you provide those products. Again, Doralice, do you see this kind of structure within Enoch? Does that resonate with how you see the world?
Yes, similar, but I would add first, before board, I would add the government of Dubai, because they are the shareholders and the government is the one who appoints the board. And then just to clarify, because we also have a business ethics department, and they are the ones, I am the lawyer who advises them, but basically we have a third-party code of conduct in place. And the reason why I wanted to clarify this is because since we are in the Middle East, we're not under a legal obligation to follow, European regulations, but we have an ethical obligation. And we have drafted and implemented a third-party code of conduct that requires our suppliers to, not get involved in child labor, human trafficking, and all these other ESG regulations. So we do it more because it's the right thing to do, because we abide by best practices, and because of our ethical principles, not so much legal and regulatory in certain areas. Of course, the UAE and the Middle East, we have center environmental restrictions and regulations, but our company tends to take more of a holistic approach. I think also the fact that we are located in Dubai, where people from all over the world comes to do business with us, we have an expectation from our business partners to do the right thing.
Okay, that's, again, great to see a different view from where we work with more private corporates generally. Okay, the next point I wanted to talk through is how companies actually address these issues. So once they've decided this is an issue that they want to address, the next question, which often comes to a compliance team, is how do you do that? What is the process you go by? And this is where frameworks come in place, compliance frameworks. Probably not the most exciting topic, but they're actually quite useful in getting people to think and order their thoughts. We in the past have used frameworks like the ISO standard for compliance, or some of their more specific standards around bribery or some other topics. But they're very good ways of structuring a compliance program. So they're very clear on what are the risks that you're trying to deal with. So in the ESG world, it might be that the child labour is the biggest risk based on your business, and how you manage that becomes the focus of the program. It's thinking about what entities fall within that. Within the supply chain, you might be able to break it into different geographies or different sort of levels of spend. Building processes that just make sure they work, they operate in a fairly structured way. Making sure you have documentation that tells you what you've done. And this becomes obviously more important when you have to report up to your customers and your investors. And lastly, it's really making sure whatever you put in place does what it's supposed to do in an efficient way. So is it effective and efficient? And that's really what a framework helps you guide you to do. It doesn't mean you can't actually have a good ESG program without following any particular framework, but it really just helps in getting ideas in place and getting that structure and that conformity, really, so everyone knows what they're doing and everyone can sort of go in the same direction. And on that point, I suppose, Doralee, does ENOC work under some kind of a framework? Is there a sort of standards that you apply?
Yes, basically, yes, of course, our different business units have different ISO requirements, but in general, from compliance perspective and how ENOC operates, we try to follow more the best practices for compliance programs issued by the US regulatory authorities, but they're also worldwide concepts, in terms of having the tone from the top, having, all these factors that you're mentioning are there, risk and scope and processes and documents, but also a very important component is training and education of employees. And that's, because you want to scope the risk and write the policy and the procedure, but if you don't train your employees and you don't make it, basically it's not going to be effective. And you want to train and educate the employees, and you want to be able to delegate on them the responsibility to enforce, because I can be sitting here in the legal department, but I will not be able to monitor what 15,000 employees are doing. So, however, if I train them and educate them and empower them, then whenever they detect something kind of, outside of the procedure, then they'll come and notify us. So we have a hotline where, complaints can be reported anonymously and get routed to the appropriate department for if need be. So, these are other tools that we have in hand, and we take these things very seriously.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so once a company has got some kind of a process and structure in place, the question is really, how do you start with ESG? It's a huge topic, and you need to think about a way of dealing with it. Often it can seem a bit insurmountable. And this is how we would generally look at it. I mean, first of all is identifying the risks. So what are the things that actually matter to you in your business? And all companies are going to be very different, from a clothing manufacturer, from a a mining company. So thinking about your business, what are the risks that really matter to you? And then often it's prioritizing those risks. Not every risk is as important as others. I mean, objectively, everything is important, but you've really got to make an effort to prioritize the risks. Which ones are the most likely to be a problem for you in your business, and which ones is your management, board, investors, which ones do they care about most? So you really need to think about prioritization, which is often one of the hardest steps because it means that you're deprioritizing some risks, which might be important in some aspects. But it's really, to be able to effectively actually manage all of those risks, you have to prioritize. And then it's really policies, making sure you're clear on what it is that you want to do as a business, making sure everyone else understands what those are, so the communication is really key. And then pushing that down the supply chain. If you're talking ESG, it's often in the supply chain that you might have your issues. So managing communication down your supply chain. And that's manageable at your direct supplier level, but then more challenging as you think about your following all the way down the supply chain, because many of the risks that you're wanting to address are not in your direct suppliers. Things like child labour and human rights are often right at the end of your supply chain, in the mines that are digging out minerals, in the factories that are producing clothes, in the farms that are producing the raw materials. That's where a lot of the social issues apply. And they're often not your direct supplier. They'll be sort of one or many sort of layers down. But if you're looking at those risks, you need to be saying, how do we actually communicate all the way down our supply chain to the people where it really applies? Again, Doralice, have you any thoughts on this structure?
Everything that you've mentioned here. Thank you.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Beyond ESG risks, what we also often talk to clients about is ESG is not the only thing in your supply chain. And while you're building some kind of a due diligence program, what we try and talk about is looking at all the risks of your suppliers at the same time, rather than having an ESG program and then other programs. And often it's things like integrity, so corruption, money laundering, cartels and competition law that you need to be thinking about. There are financial risks. Often this is already well covered by procurement, so making sure that there's credit management, fraud management. You've got sustainability issues, which again is often well understood by procurement teams. And now one of the newer areas is cyber risk. Cyber risk both in sustainability, as in if a supplier has a significant cyber breach, that could take them out of business for a period. But also if they're connected to your business by some kind of technology, they actually potentially pose a cyber risk to yourself. So that cyber vendor management is becoming an area of significant concern for a lot of companies. So the point here is really that these are all risks within your supply chain. How much those risks apply to any particular supplier will vary greatly, but that's what the challenge of a supply chain due diligence program really is working out where your issues are and how they apply to any particular supplier so you can actively manage them. Because the reality is you can't look at every supplier in the same way. Most companies will have sort of massive supply chains, tens of thousands, up to hundreds of thousands of suppliers. And they can't all be dealt with at the same level of scrutiny. So you've got to focus on which are the most highest risk of your suppliers and what are they risks for, because the methods you apply to your risk assessment and then your management and mitigation actions really depends on the risks that you're addressing in a particular supplier. So that's why taking a holistic view is important, but you've got to take that broad view and then very quickly narrow it down onto the suppliers that actually matter and are material to your business. Okay, how do we tend to look at it from Refinitiv as a provider of a lot of services and products that manage this? The first thing we do is really break out the different needs that our clients have. We have a lot of financial institutions as clients. For ESG content, that is two things. There's now the investment need for banks and asset managers, where they're wanting to understand the ESG component of businesses they invest in or they fund. But they're also corporates themselves. So banks have supply chains, and banks are starting to look at those supply chains in the same as any other corporates. Most of our work at Refinity is with large corporates who have very large supply chains all around the world, as well as their distribution networks, but really focusing for ESG world on their supply chains. So we're looking at those. And then corporations that are very focused on specific areas like energy, which we're talking about today. So the first thing is really to understand what kind of business it is, because the way we can help very much depends on the type of business. And if we can stop here for a quick poll, it'd be interesting to understand, how do you identify your risks, the risks in your business through that engagement life cycle? So what I was talking about just before on how does the workflow, or do you have a single way of looking at it? Do you have lots of different groups looking at the process? Do you not really look at it at all? I know a lot of you at the beginning were saying you're starting to look at this, but if you do have some kind of process, is it ad hoc without any formal process? Or is there a single workflow? So if I can get you guys to indicate how you manage those risks, that would be great. I'll just take a few minutes for that. Okay, all right, fairly evenly split. I think it's interesting. There's actually no clear answer here. Single automated workflow, I think, is what most people are wanting to get to, but it is more of a challenge. I think historically, most of our clients are sort of in each stakeholder group looking after their own. So it's good to see that's not the predominant answer here. But it is interesting that, that there is no clear view on this. Our view is really building a single process. That is the answer that we'd like to help clients get to. Really building a process that is as automated as possible, given the size and complexity of supply chains. But it really takes into account the types of risks that people have. We provide screening services for some of the risk areas. So certainly the WorldCheck data is often used in screening for things like money laundering and corruption and some of the environmental issues. We have processes where we're helping clients ask for information from their supply chain, because often that's the only place you can get ESG type information is by asking the suppliers themselves. We help with training and certifications. So with some of the systems that we provide. And we help people set up a renewal process, because it tends to be an ongoing process. And so that's really what we work with corporates and banks to think about this whole ESG topic in conjunction with a number of the other risk topics, and build processes. And in my opinion, automation and process and systems is the only way to deal with the volume that you've got in your supply chain. So the key points from today's session, first of all, it's going to become more important that people can show what they're doing. It's not the case anymore that you can have an internal compliance program that just manages their risks as effectively as it can. You've really got to start thinking about how you can show that to external stakeholders, particularly investors, customers, and your internal management. I think ESG topics are going to be key, and they're not going away. I think there'll be a lot more work around standardization of what people mean. There's a lot of work within the EU and some industry bodies about what we mean by ESG. At the moment, there's a number of standards that people can use as to what they mean by ESG, but that will, I think, sort itself out. You've got to continue to manage the risks. I think those risks aren't going away, especially if you're looking more at identifying risks, then it becomes a bit of an obligation to actually manage those risks. In some cases by changing suppliers, but in many cases by working with your suppliers on what it is you're looking for and how they can be better at providing what you're wanting. I won't go into more of the detail, but that was really where we wanted to end up. So Doris, do you have any final comments on any of the ESG content in the supply chain?
Yes. Well, first I wanted to thank Refinitiv. I think it's very timely that you chose to do this webinar. I mean, first, in our last board meeting, the board of directors were actually, wanting to know more about whether we have an ESG centralized function and, what's management doing about it. So it's a very hot topic. And also because traditionally, I can tell you, since I joined INOS in 2010, back then, we didn't even have a code of conduct, and we didn't have to. We were not required. I mean, compliance is a fairly recent kind of activity by companies, and in the Middle East, even more so. So I've been lucky that I was at this company since the beginning when we drafted the first code of conduct, and trying to get the buy-in from top management and trying to train employees, and particularly in this culture where, for example, they were so used to gift giving, as a measure of let's do business, so and having to change the culture and the mindset. But now I realize, it's no longer about trade compliance, which is mostly what I've been doing, and bribery or legal and regulatory risks in those areas. My scope has just recently expanded because also I'm expected to be working on the ESG aspects and, advising the EHS department on, what they're required to do. And I think the career in compliance, I feel very blessed in the sense that I'm one of the few people in the company who gets a bird's eye view of what's going on, and have the freedom to talk to different business units and different departments, because what happens a lot of times in a large corporation is people just get focused on what they're doing, and they're not really knowing what the other departments are doing, or they're not really sharing information or communicating. So one of the big aspects that I would put here in these key takeaways, and you have it, communicate, but communicate also among your departments, communicate with your colleagues, and most importantly, educate and train your employees. Because like I said, no point in writing a policy or writing a contract and if your employees don't know what it entails and what they have to do. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your insights, Doris. It's great to have people in the business, and especially the view from a state entity. I think ESG and certainly supply chains are very much top of people's minds at the moment. Certainly with the current situation in Russia and Ukraine, is having a significant impact on supply chains all around the world. So I think it is a topic that will be at many boards in the months to come. Not just the ESG aspects, but supply chains in general and sustainability of supply chains. Okay, so thank you all very much for your time today. We now have some time for a Q&A, so please ask any questions that you have from myself or Doris, and we'll work to answer those questions.
Yeah, I can see there's a question already. I can read it for you. So the question we have: what are the key factors that need to be considered while building an ESG score metrics for corporates in oil and gas domain? I believe this question is for you, Dolores. So what are the key factors that you think corporates need to be considering while building an ESG score for?
I mean, I don't know, maybe because I'm in the legal department, I would say risk is number one. You have to look really what's your exposure and, and identify or scope the kind of risks. If, for example, yes, if you are in an industry, well, this question is for oil and gas, but if you're in an industry where you think, there might be some child labor involved in your supply chain, then that would be in your risks, and that's something you have to consider. So first you have to look what kind of risks, for oil and gas particular, environmental, certainly. Environmental is a big one. And then also social, because usually oil and gas companies are government-owned or have government ties. So scope the risk and then try to mitigate it and try to, write policies and procedures to regulate it. And again, train the employees and communicate to stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you so much. Indeed, there's another question here. And the question is, what are the main differences between sustainability reporting and ESG reporting? What will be the positive impact to convert to ESG? So
I think if I can answer this one, I think they're closely aligned. ESG, I think, is often a subset of sustainability. Often in the investment community, they're looking at sustainable finance as a specific topic. ESG is probably more structured, and certainly there's more work going on into what do we mean by ESG, and the frameworks that are being applied from various providers. They all drive up into sustainability, but I think sustainability is broader than just ESG. It's more about the business continuity and many other factors. I think ESG topics, once they have the more standardized approach to reporting, will be an easier thing for companies to get their heads around or to be able to document. I think sustainability has always been quite broad, somewhat nebulous in how you describe sustainability. I think ESG will over time overtake it because it is a bit more structured.
Yeah, true. And one more question here. What methodologies corporate can adopt to obtain an up-to-date ESG information about their suppliers? So what are the methodologies that you think corporates can use to have an up-to-date ESG information?
So I think, if I can take that one as well, in terms of a methodology, I think if you're talking about where you get information from, there's a number of different ways to get information about your suppliers, and which is most appropriate really depends on the risks you're looking at. For something like carbon and emissions, you can ask the supplier, and that's often the most direct route. So send them a questionnaire or speak to them. It depends a bit on whether your suppliers have that information to hand. If they're not tracking that, it can be quite difficult. So that's one way of looking at it. Second is to get external views. So either audits to go on site and look at, again, things like carbon emissions or human rights is something that often you can't get other than by sending people on site for an audit. And the third way is estimations. So using metrics which indicate based on the type of entity and the type of business it's in the country that it's in, some kind of an estimate of what you think will be happening. That kind of assessment is good because often there is no real information. The company doesn't have it. It's not cost effective to send people on site. So you need to start with an estimation. But then over time, you build on that with more accurate and more specific information. So that's generally what we would be suggesting. But it's putting those pieces together in a way that makes most sense for the risks that you're trying to address. It is really the key to getting the ESG world right.
If I may jump in, I would also add media and reputation. So searching for, what's the reputation of this company, or have they been involved in any, sometimes, of course, you cannot believe everything that the internet says, but sometimes you get useful information and you have doubt, then you dig bigger. And this is why a company like mine would retain someone like Refinitiv to do extra digging for information if they need, if it's in a foreign country, they go to the ground, and that's what was the reputation of this entity. Of course, there's a cost involved, so it depends. The company has to assess internally whether it makes sense to outsource for this kind of study, how much information you want to get, but that's also an option.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much. And the final question we have for the session is, and that's quite, I would say, serious question. Could we reach the point where ESG due diligence supersedes the AML and compliance due diligence in terms of impact? And could you just share with us some recent violations in the ESG world? So that's a serious question. Should we one day expect ESG to be more important than AML and compliance due diligence?
I don't think so. I think ESG is going to be very much focused on supply chains. That's where most of the ESG risks will occur. It doesn't mean you won't be looking at some of the topics within ESG in your sales channels and in your customers themselves, but typically the ESG topics will be in your supply chain. And when you're looking at your distribution and sales channels, you'll be looking much more at the traditional corruption, antitrust kind of issues and sanctioned issues. And in your customer risk, it's money laundering, it's sanctions. It really depends on your business, but those are the kind of issues. So I think what we'll see is that due diligence will be much more targeted according to how you are doing business with a particular subject. But what we will see is that there is already much more focus on ESG topics when you're looking at your supply chain. So I think that's how it won't take over from some of those other topics. They'll just be much more targeted at the right places.
If I may add something, I'm going to play the devil's advocate. So basically, when you look at the impact, right, I think you will always be in a worse position if you're caught money laundering, right, than if you are violating, let's say, an environmental regulation. Because if it's money laundering, right, it could be tied to terrorism, your bank accounts could be frozen. I mean, banks are not going to want to give you credit or deal with you. There's this other catastrophic repercussions to your company. However, if you ask me right now, because even this morning I was having a discussion on anti-money laundering with one of our insurance companies. Basically, they wanted us to agree in their insurance policy to comply with UAE anti-money laundering regulations. And our position to them was like, actually, that regulation applies only to the financial sector and to insurance firms and brokerage firms and law firms and realtors. It does not apply to an oil and gas sector. So right now, the legislation that we have in the UAE, of course, we are government-owned. We're not laundering money. Let me clarify that. And we have an obligation to our business partners and our banks. When you look strictly, what's the law right now in the UAE? I have more environmental regulations from the Dubai municipality than I have anti-money laundering regulation from the UAE government. So yeah, I'm more regulated now in the environmental sector, but if I am caught laundering money, I have more to lose.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you, Dolores. That leaves us with the last question, and we would like to conclude by thanking the participants and the audience, and also thanking our speakers for having an informative session. And we wish you a great day, and until we organize the next webinar, we will continue to have something similar in the future. So thank you so much again, and wish you a great day.